In today's lecture, we're going to keep on talking about all of our different senses. So last time we talked about our sense of hearing, our auditory system, and this time we're going to start by talking about our gustatory system, our sense of taste. And so unlike the first section where we spent a ton of time talking about our hearing and all of the different processes involved, you'll find that these ones in the middle are going to be pretty short and sweet. Sometimes because we don't know a whole heck of a lot about the systems, and other times just because they are figuratively simple systems. So you could probably judge by how long we spend on a particular system, how much detail you should know about that system, just as a thought. So as per usual, we can start by talking about what is our stimulus in terms of this system. So we've said that our gustatory system is our sensory system for taste, and here our stimuli are soluble chemical substances. So chemical substances just meaning anything that is made up of molecules. So anything that we're eating is going to have quite a few of these soluble chemical substances. And when we say soluble, we basically just mean that it can dissolve in our saliva so that it's accessible to our receptors. And our receptors for this gustatory system are clusters of taste cells that are found in our taste buds. And these taste buds line the trenches around the tiny bumps on the tongue. And I found it very interesting because I always thought that the bumps themselves were our taste buds, but in fact they are not. The taste buds exist in the sort of grooves around the bumps, which we can see on this next slide here. So if we look, these little circles would be like the bumps you can see on your tongue, and deep into these crevices and these grooves around those bumps, that's where our taste buds are located. I just thought that was quite interesting because I was wrong for many, many years about that. So for the most part, we have, at least they think, 4 different tastes that we can distinguish between: salty, sweet, sour, and bitter. And that has been sort of long established, but in more recent years, we have some evidence for a 5th taste, which is called umami. So unlike the idea of salty or sweet, where those are kind of easy to conceptualize, if you think of something that's salty, you kind of know what that tastes like. But umami is a little bit more difficult to describe, we could say. So it's kind of like talking about a quality or sort of a savoriness to a taste. And so that one is the 5th accepted taste that we can taste. And so for this, we're showing this picture of the tongue because there's a fairly common misconception about our sense of taste. And this is the idea that we can only detect certain tastes on certain parts of our tongue. And if we look at this graph here, it's showing which of the 4 up until now well-accepted tastes, where we have receptors that pick up each of those different types of tastes. And even though we have, say, different sensitivities on different parts of our tongue, so the tip of our tongue seems to be a lot better at getting salty, it doesn't mean that it can't pick up those other tastes. So we can still taste if something is bitter or sour or sweet at the tip of our tongue. We're just better at tasting salty there. So as opposed to that misconception where people might say, oh, you only taste salty things at the tip of your tongue, that's not actually the case. We'll have a little bit more sensitivity to bitterness towards the back and the sides, but we still have that full range of possible tastes that we can detect. So just educating everyone on that misconception. Now, perception of taste is going to depend on more than just the taste itself, because if we only have those 4 or 5 different kinds of taste receptors, then how do we get so many complex and different tastes? And so this is coming from mostly a complex pattern of interactions. So having however many sour taste buds active versus however many sweet versus however many salty, that interaction, those ratios, will create different patterns of neural activity that's all initiated by our taste receptors. So our tongue is going to pick up on those chemicals dissolved in our saliva. It activates our taste buds, our taste receptors, and sends a signal to our brain. And our brain sort of sorts out what ratio of different receptors are active at any given time. Now, we'll come back to flavor in just a minute because taste is only part of what we're getting from our food. But we're going to stick with just the activation of our taste receptors for now. And there's some evidence that says that some of our basic taste preferences might be innate. So we could have things that we are predisposed to liking just because of what's in our genetics. Some of them are automatically regulated by physiological mechanisms, which basically means as certain processes are going on in your body, you're going to want and crave certain things. A great example of this is young children have an obsession with sugar. And it's because those sweet things tend to be high in calories. And if we think about it evolutionarily speaking, when you are young and growing, the idea is that you need as many nutrients as you can to try and grow and become an adult. In today's society, we have this weird situation where we don't have as much of a struggle to find food and to find good food as we would have in our hunter-gatherer phase, or even before that. And so we're predisposed to want these sweet things because they should be good for us and help us grow. But now we just have easy access to things that are high in calories, and it's not necessarily good to have them all the time. So that's kind of a discrepancy between how we evolved to exist and how we exist now. But that's for another day. So despite the fact that some of these basic taste preferences are innate, they are genetic, we do have a lot of taste preferences that are learned. So as you're exposed to more foods, you're going to like more foods. We can think about maybe you like food that you grew up with, so you learned to prefer things that were familiar. And again, we'll swing back to that a little bit later because that's kind of bringing some culture and society into our preferences, which definitely plays a huge role. And while we're talking about tasting and taste ability, we should talk about the fact that not everybody tastes the same. So we have some people who are non-tasters versus super tasters versus medium tasters. So there are some people who just aren't very sensitive to taste. They could eat the best meal ever prepared, or they could eat a pack of Mr. Noodles and it doesn't really matter to them. Or you can have super tasters. Maybe you have that friend who can taste a meal and tell you every spice the chef used. Or you could be somewhere in the middle where you have a sense of taste, but it's not fantastic, it just gets you by. And so these variations in sensitivity mean that no two people are really going to get the same experience, even if they're eating the same food. So that's another thing to keep in mind, because if we're going on learning things from experience, then their experience is going to be different based on how they perceive that experience. And additionally, this difference in taste sensitivity can also influence people's eating habits. So like I said, a non-taster can't tell the difference between a gourmet meal and, a pack of instant noodles. So what would motivate them to go out of their way to cook extravagant meals if they enjoy something simple that much easier? So, maybe they're going to end up not eating as good. They're not going to eat as good food. They're going to eat stuff that's quick and easy to prepare, maybe that's less healthy, and that could cause some health problems. And that works the other way. So super tasters tend to have better eating habits health-wise than non-tasters. So people who can taste all the ingredients and who know quality ingredients, they're going to prefer to eat things that were made from scratch. Whether that means they cook for themselves or they go out to restaurants or whatever. Eating things that aren't mass prepared in advance tends to make them have better habits and better health habits. And just an interesting side note here, women tend to be super tasters more often than men are. I'm not sure why they are predisposed to be super tasters, but more of them are. And we'll notice that a couple of our different perceptions and differences in perceptions tend to be biased based on sex. And now, as promised, we can come back to flavor. So not just taste, but flavor, which is a combination of taste and smell, as well as the tactile sensation of food in your mouth. So when we're talking about the flavor of a meal, it's not just what we're tasting, it's the whole experience. And if you've ever had a cold and eaten a meal that's, maybe it's your favorite meal and your nose is stuffy and maybe it tastes a little bit bland, that's because you've lost some of the flavor because you're missing the odor part of eating that meal. And that's a really nice segue to bring us into our next system, which is our olfactory system. And we can start talking about our sense of smell and how it is we're perceiving smells. So in this case, we're going to talk about humans because it's psychology and we care very deeply about humans. But it's good to note that humans are relatively insensitive to smell. This means that while we do have a sense of smell, if you compare us to pretty much any other animal, we're really bad at using smell. So you can think of a bloodhound that can tell different scents apart and can pick up very tiny amounts or very small traces of smells and track them for miles. Humans are pretty much only going to notice things that are very, very strongly scented, and we're not good at localizing those scents. So this isn't our best system of sensation, but we do have one, so we can talk about it. And in this case, our stimuli are going to be volatile chemical substances. And this sounds like really important and like a really big thing, but all it means is when we say volatile, it just means that it's easy to become a vapor at room temperature. So they aren't going to stay in solid or liquid form. These chemicals, these molecules from our food or whatever else is putting off a smell, are going to turn into gases that can then travel to our noses. So a volatile chemical substance is just something that evaporates easily at room temperature, which sounds far less exciting. And then in this case, our receptors are going to be olfactory cilia, so little hair-like structures that are located along our nasal passages. And we can get a visual of that here. So if we're looking at the inside of our nose, up at the top here, we have this olfactory bulb that connects to all of these cilia, our receptor cells for scent. And so our understanding of smell is actually fairly recent. So back in the 90s, that's when there was the first publication that was clarifying how we are recognizing smells. So we have gene sets that are consisting of 1,000 different genes affecting all of our olfactory receptor cells. When we're talking about a gene set, it's basically like a whole string along one of our chromosomes, a whole set of genes back to back to back that are all involved in our sense of smell. And so these were helping code for different types of receptors that are going to allow us to bind to different smells. And so for this discovery of which genes were involved and where they're involved and some of the mechanism and how they work. These guys won a Nobel Prize back in 2004. So I include these dates just to stress that this is a fairly recent understanding of how this process works. And I always find it interesting because when I came out of high school, I assumed that we knew everything and that I would, go off and be able to learn all the things in university. But in fact, there are a lot of these things that are either recently understood or not completely understood, or sometimes we really just don't have any clue of how they work. Kind of like our talk of perceiving things other than pure tones. It's kind of less concrete than I thought it would be. But that's why this slide is here. Now, we've kind of hinted at this already, where we talked about having multiple olfactory receptors, and it makes sense because odors don't classify as neatly or as cleanly as what we were seeing with our taste buds. So our taste receptors fell into those 5 categories, but we have about 350 or more different kind of scent receptors. So these olfactory receptors in our noses, there are 350 or more of them, and they each bind to different kinds of chemicals. And so the idea here being sort of different shapes of chemicals, different volatile organic compounds are going to produce different smells because they're binding to different receptors. So we can go back to this example here, and maybe the smell of a rose is going to bind to receptor A and B. And when we smell that, we know it's rose smell. And so there's going to be more specific scents, but with only 350 receptors, every single smell can't have its own unique receptor. There's still going to be a combination of receptors that activate in response to any given type of scent, because, as it says here, we can distinguish between about 10,000 different odors. So we don't have one receptor for each odor we can identify, so there's going to be multiples being activated. And just like how we talked about with our sense of taste, where our brains interpret different patterns of activation from the receptors to determine what the taste is, our sense of smell is going to do kind of the same thing, where different patterns of activation from our olfactory receptors will produce different recognition of odors. So our sense of smell shows a uniquely powerful version of sensory adaptation. So we talked about sensory adaptation at the beginning as something that's general and can apply to all of our different senses. Our sense of smell shows a really strong version of that, which is why I used our sense of smell as the example explaining sensory adaptation. So our perceived strength of an odor will usually fade to less than half its original strength within only 4 minutes. So this happens really, really, really quickly. So it might take you a little while to start ignoring a sound. Maybe there's fire alarm testing happening in your building, and you're still going to notice that alarm for a very, very long time because it's really hard to ignore something that loud. But even a very strong smell, we're going to become very not aware of it very quickly, which is why this is our usual example for sensory adaptation. And with our olfactory system, we happen to have, yet again, a difference in the sexes, where females tend to be a little bit better than males at odor recognition tasks. And this is an overall, in general, kind of a thing. It doesn't mean that all females are better than all males at these tasks. In fact, I myself have almost no sense of smell, so I find this, I'm on the lower end of that range in their sampling. And then for a little bit of a practical use of our sense of smell, and a little bit of a unique side note, we can talk very briefly about chemical communication and specifically pheromones. And pheromones are chemical messages, usually something that's imperceptible, that can be sent by one organism and received by another member of the same species. So these are almost like imperceivable or non-noticeable signals that are going to get you a message without you being aware that you've received a message. And in a lot of species, pheromones are very important. If you've ever had a dog, or and you walk your dog and they have to pee on every bush that they pass, they're marking their territory with pheromones. So they are giving a message to other dogs about this being their territory. And though a lot of us don't necessarily think of humans having these kinds of traits, we do give off and are still susceptible to other humans' pheromones. And so I included just a cool study that was done in the late 90s. And I'll just talk about it very, very briefly because I find it interesting. And they basically had a bunch of young men who were participants in this study. So undergraduate students, they came to this study. They took a picture of each individual. They gave each person a white shirt, a white cotton jersey shirt. They were all the same. And the participants had to put on the shirt and then go play basketball or do something active so that they would sweat in them. And then the researchers collected the shirts at the end, labeled them with the participant number, and flagged it with the picture. And that was sort of half of the study. That was collecting their data. Then they took those shirts and got women participants to smell the shirts and rate the shirt wearer based on attractiveness. Now, the ones that were told to smell the shirt weren't shown the picture of the person who wore the shirt. They just had to do it based off of smell. And so I'm assuming the participants would be like, okay, like this smells bad, but maybe it's not terrible. 5 out of 10. They had then another batch of women who rated just the pictures based on attractiveness. And then the researchers compared the scores of attractiveness based on the pictures with the scores of attractiveness based on the smell. And they were surprised because there was a really good correlation between both of those. So the men who were rated as being very physically attractive were rated as being very scentily attractive. And people who were unattractive were rated as not smelling good. And so they found that even though we don't think of us as being perceptible of even though we don't think of humans as being susceptible to pheromones, we are apparently very susceptible to it, and they might be giving us information that could be helpful. So I thought it was interesting to include that because you don't think of humans as giving off or being aware of pheromones, and yet we are.